this movement that we've inherited, this thing that started hundreds of years ago in England, that we call the Methodist movement or the Wesleyan movement. The uniqueness of it was that we didn't simply preach the gospel and leave. We didn't simply bring about revivals and then take off and not do anything. Wesley would stick around and would band people together, would group people together. And it's in those relationships and the accountability there that transformation happened. And I believe when it comes to leadership development with young people, that we owe it to young people to not simply inspire them and then leave them, but rather to journey with them so that they can have a better chance at faithfully following God's call in their life.
Welcome to World Methodist Evangelism's Real Faith, Real World podcast, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. Celebrating our 50th anniversary, World Evangelism desires for Christ followers within the global Wesleyan family to become agents of transformation by sharing the gospel through the power of the Holy Spirit. We accomplish this through training, gathering, and resourcing to fulfill our mission to connect, equip, and encourage networks of Christian leaders to build faith-sharing movements around the world. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the folks at Christ Church Memphis for making this podcast possible. My name is Rob Haynes, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Paulo Lopez. Paulo, welcome.
Thanks again for having me, Rob. It's been a while.
It has been way too long, but we're so pleased to have you back on this episode. We're here to talk today about metanoia. There's been some changes and some exciting new things coming along.
Yes. I'm excited to talk about metanoia. Rob, as you know, metanoia is an answer for us to the question of how do we inspire and connect and equip young, emerging leaders around the world to build faith-sharing movements in their own context. And so what started with an event many years ago called ICYCE and gathered young leaders from different places in the world is now called Metanoia. And so we're excited to once again be kind of ramping up for metanoia.
Okay, so we're using all kinds of different terms here. Let's stop and unpack those just a little bit. First of all, what does the word metanoia mean, and how are you using in terms of this particular event that we're talking about here?
Yeah. In short, metanoia means transformation. If you stop and think of metanoia, the best symbol we have for metanoia is the transformation that the caterpillar has into a butterfly.
Right.
So what's happening with that caterpillar is metanoia. That's the transformation that's going on, and so that's sort of the way we think about young leaders who are just now understanding what it means to be called by God. And what we know is that God calls people in many similar ways without regard for country or culture or language or ethnicity. People are being called at a young age to follow Jesus in some really neat ways all over the world. And so those are the people that we're investing in.
Okay, and then go back and explain a little bit about ICYCE. Then we want to talk about what's happening in the future.
Sure. ICYCE is something that was kind of birthed at the heart of Eddie Fox, who used to be the executive director for WME, and is sort of the precursor for metanoia. And with ICYCE, we gathered young adults from different places in the world, in different countries. It wasn't really consistent as far as how often it was, and I actually can't remember quite exactly how many of them we had. Do you know that number?
I don't right off the top of my head, but seems like
I want to say 7.
something like that.
I want to say 7.
Yeah.
I might be wrong, but once in Korea and in England and in Brazil, and in many other places, and people gathered from all over the globe. Young adults gathered from all over the globe. If another way to put it is metanoia is sort of an evolution of YCE.
And there was a pause for a while, the last ICYCE being in South Korea, and then we relaunched Metanoia in Costa Rica a few years ago, where we had our last global gathering. But here, as we're recording this in the third quarter of 2021, the pandemic still presents all sorts of issues for traveling. And so tell us a little bit about what's happening with Metanoia in response to this, because a lot of our folks that are listening were planning on being at the Metanoia gathering in Sweden in 2020, and then that was postponed because of the pandemic and into 21, and now even the World Methodist Conference gathering in 21 has been postponed. So that's affected a Metanoia a little bit. So kind of catch us up on what's going on with all of that.
Sure. I think it's important, Rob, to even take a step back and just realize that anytime we host an event, whether it is Metanoia or anything else that WME does, that what we do isn't an end in and of itself.
It's an excellent point.
The point of what we do are the people that get to journey, that we get to journey with, and that we get to help guide in a sense. And so Metanoia is only relevant to the extent that there are young people located somewhere within the Wesleyan movement around the world: Methodists, Free Methodists, Wesleyans, Nazarenes, and all different kinds of traditions in all over the world, who right now are coming to give their lives to Jesus. And some of them, right, it takes a unique kind of person. Some of them are looking around and asking some questions like, is this it? My local church? Is this it? Or is there more?
Right.
And they're hungry for more. And they want to see beyond their local town, their local church, into this movement of the church that is much greater than any individual piece of it. And so we are trying to identify those young people, and then coming alongside them, helping guide them from curiosity to formation in leadership as a next generation of global leaders in the Wesleyan movement who are hungry to see faith-sharing movements all over the world. And so when the pandemic hit, the question we're asking is not how do we pivot in order to keep doing what we do. The question we're asking is how do we pivot in order to continue serving people who, if we don't do this, will not have the opportunity to be exposed to a global view of what it looks like to be a Christian in the many contexts around the world in the 21st century, and what God might be inviting them into. And so in trying to answer that question, we thought, is what are our options? Do we cancel and postpone once again? Do we do something online? Do we, there's just, an n number of options. And what we realized is that if the goal is to come alongside these young leaders in kind of awakening them to the idea of being a part of this global movement, that we could do this regionally around the world in a safer way when it comes to COVID. And so instead of waiting another 4 years to be able to meet globally with everybody, we are shifting to regional gatherings for the next several years as kind of a model for reaching young adults in through Metanoia. And so the first one, because we had already been planning on meeting in Europe, our first one will be what we're calling Metanoia Europe, and that'll happen next year. And it'll be the first of several regional gatherings. So we'll meet in Europe at the end of the summer next year, and then we will meet we will have regional gatherings in South America, in Asia, in Africa, and in North America to begin with, and we'll see where we go from there.
Right.
But we're hoping this will be a way where we can sort of respect the limitations regionally and have the best kind of reach for people in a certain geographic area. So we're really excited about this, and we will be meeting in Durham in England next year, and we're just super excited. I know you have a history with Durham, having gone to school there, and so I'm sure you're excited as well. But they're kind of opening up the doors for us in partnership with folks connected to the Methodist Church in England, and we hope to see a really great group of young leaders from all over Europe.
And there's a couple of reasons why Durham is interesting, not only our connections there, but St. John's Durham, connected there to Durham University. The cathedral there has been a place of theological training for 1,000 years already. The Wesley Study Center is directly connected there, so there's a lot of Wesleyan Methodist studies going on. There are people training for ministry through the Church of England connected there, and so it's just a very rich environment there. At the same time, Durham is just 15 minutes from Newcastle, which was the center of John Wesley's missional outreach during his ministry. So London was kind of the nexus of everything going on, of course. Closer over to Bristol was the center of the preaching and a lot of the field preaching there, but it was Newcastle that was the missionary outpost for the early Methodists. And that's one of the things I really love about that. In modern times, it gives us a really easy connection. Durham is just a 15-minute train ride from the Newcastle airport, and a easy taxi ride as well. So it just makes a great center and a great location for current activities, and also the history that we enjoy as Methodists in that.
We could not be more pleased with the idea of doing this in Durham. And so, of course, this is just under a year away, and so we are running as fast as possible to get as many people involved as possible, particularly from Europe, and excited to see what happens, what begins to happen there. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit more about this, but what begins to happen at this particular event in Europe.
Just to pin it, it's 2022, begins August 29th through September 4th, August 29th through September 4th of 2022. Before we get into that too much, Paolo, I want to talk, though, about just who do you envision being at Metanoia? I mean, you've used the term leader, young adult, all this sort of thing. So first of all, what do you mean by young adult? What does young mean to you in that? I think that's important.
Sure. So specifically, what the language that we like to use around this, because we believe this is where the need is young emerging leaders. And when we're talking about metanoia, we're talking about young emerging leaders. Typically, these are young people between the ages of 18 and 35. Typically, they have already been involved in the life of their own local churches. Some of them might have been involved even a little bit beyond their local churches.
Yeah,
and all of them with sensing, even if they don't quite understand it yet, but sensing a call to something else, so to leadership in the body of Christ,
right?
And they can't quite articulate it, which is why we want to spend some time with them.
Sure,
right? They can't quite articulate it. They don't quite understand what that means, but they're in this discovery season.
Right.
And so, 18 through 35, and we're less concerned about exactly the age there and more concerned about what's going on right now in their life,
Sure.
Which is this kind of awakening to a call that God has upon their life.
So you're not necessarily talking about someone who is already a pastor or elected to a position or something like that.
No.
Don't even have to be necessarily working in a church, right?
Absolutely not. Actually, we really like, when it comes to metanoia, we really like working with young adults who don't even have an intention to become a pastor, a clergy person, or a professional in ministry, a staff person at a church or anything like that. We very much believe in the priesthood of all believers, and that there's a gap in understanding of young people, that they can be doctors and they can be lawyers and they can be salespersons and they can be anything that God might be placing them in, and serve God faithfully and lead God's people faithfully through those vocations.
Yeah. That's important because this idea of professional clergy is really being turned upside down in a lot of ways. And part of that is the current movements of the church. But I think also it's a better understanding of who we are called to be as Christians. And that's why when we say that we're here to build faith-sharing movements with Christian leaders, it's not just the one who stands up in the pulpit on Sunday mornings, but it's the people then serving in all different walks of life too.
Yes, and Rob, and I have to say, I'm biased because you know me, I am not a clergy person. I'm not a pastor.
Yeah,
and I'm biased in that most of the most exciting stories I've heard of movements just kind of blowing up in different places in the world where people awaken to the gospel and they begin to share with others and the church grows explosively. Most of those stories that are really, really exciting to hear about are not happening amongst groups of pastors. They're happening with everyday people doing everyday things.
Yeah. So that's who's going to come to Metanoia. Tell us what's going to happen during that week. Kind of walk me through. If I think I might want to come, what's it going to be like?
Sure. It used to be, Rob, that we were just excited for and hoped that that young people would come to this event, that they'd be inspired, and that they would go from there and change the world.
Right.
And in earnest, I mean, it happened to many people. Actually, Kim Reisman, who's our executive director, had a really significant experience at an ICYCE event. I think it may have been the very first one that happened in the 80s.
It was in 1980. It was in England, coincidentally.
Yeah. And she'll point to that event in her life as something that was pivotal in discovering her call to ministry. This kind of changed the direction of where she was going in life. And so we point back to those and we realize there's a lot that's happened. However, what we're also learning is that right now we're building this community of people throughout the years that have gone through an event like Metanoia, but we have not done a really great job at cultivating those relationships and walking alongside those leaders and then measuring the result of what's happening by virtue of them being a part of the Metanoia community. And so what we're trying to do now that's different is we are treating the event Metanoia as a connection point. We're identifying all these potential young leaders around Europe now for next year, but really around the world for all these different events. And then we're bringing them together so that we can connect them with us and with each other and with some really amazing resources. But then we hope to challenge those young leaders to commit while they're together, to commit to spending an extended amount of time with each other. When it comes to Metanoia, this will probably happen virtually in cohorts that will continue to meet for at least a year. That will kind of journey with them through a process of identifying call, of creating some actionable plans for their life and ministry, for accountability, for prayer and support and relationship. And we're really believing that this is a healthy way to move forward. So we want to identify them. We want to connect them at this event. We want to equip them through these cohorts. And then we want to continue for the next few decades to continue to encourage and support them with resources.
So this is not just a, hey, get jazzed up for a week because you've come to this conference and then, hey, go back home and you wind up in the wilderness. You're talking about a longer term walking together on this journey of a young adult who is trying to discern how God's calling them to serve.
Yes.
Excellent.
We want to cultivate relationships, not just between us and these young leaders, but primarily amongst them. We want them to gather. We're thinking, what would these kind of generational encounters look like, right? These groups of people that are coming together, spending time together in these cohorts. We imagine 20, 30 years down the line, a lot of these one-day young adults looking back and going, man, I just grew with this core of people that happened to be of different ethnicities, different cultures, who spoke different languages, and look at the impact and the fruitfulness of this ministry that God kind of just tossed us into in our lifetime. And it would be really cool when you and I are much, much older to be able to look back and say, man, look at what God is doing through the lives of so many young leaders.
Yeah, that's right. So this one will be focused on Metanoia Europe. So what is the best way for someone to learn more or to get connected so that they can be informed as we're getting ready to ramp up to that into August, first part of September of 22?
Sure. One way to learn more is to visit us at worldmethodist.org, worldmethodist.org. There are a few ways that we're telling folks, hey, these are the best ways for you to get involved if you've been connected with World Methodist Evangelism for a while now, or even if you haven't. One thing that we're telling folks, hey, this is a great way to be involved, is if you know a young emerging leader, particularly folks that are based right now in Europe, who you believe would be a great fit for Metanoia, then help us connect with them. You can email me at Paulo, Paulo, at worldmethodist.org, Paulo at worldmethodist.org. And I'm sure, Rob, that you'll be putting this information in the show notes.
Of course, yep.
But help us connect with them. See, we can't identify people without relationships.
Exactly.
And so we're banking on the relationships we have right now to identify these young leaders around the world. Secondly, we're asking for folks to connect with us through prayer.
Yes. So important.
I honestly believe that this ministry of Metanoia begins way before we ever meet any one of these young leaders, and it starts with prayer and preparation, asking God to awaken people to the possibility of coming, to begin to prepare those that are going to be there, and to begin to soften their hearts, and also begin to do the work of calling them. And then the third is to give generously. A lot of these young people are just that, they're young, and they do not have the funds or the means to necessarily pay all of their way to an event like this, where 9 times out of 10, particularly in Europe, it'll involve some sort of air travel,
right.
And they will be staying with us, and there's meals to be covered and all of that. And so while those who can and are able will pay their way to be there, some churches will support their own young people to be there.
Sure.
It does a lot of good if folks that are listening are able to to give towards sending young adults to a Metanoia event. Of course, starting now in Europe, but any one of the events that we're putting together.
That would roll out in future years as
Yes.
other parts of the world.
Yes.
When do you think registration for 2022 in Europe will open?
I think we're launching registrations as of the end of this year, probably around December. Is when this is going to launch. We'll begin sending out some emails. This is another way you can get connected on our website. If you will add your email to our mailer list, then you will get emails with updates about what's going on and how to get people registered and sent to Metanoia. But I believe we're opening that registration starting December 1st.
Great. And all that will be in social media as well. And all of those links and connections are in our show notes also. Paolo, I'm just so grateful for what you do in terms of leading young adults. And I think it's so important that you talk about going along the journey with people. That's who we are at World Evangelism, is not just a one-off sort of thing, but it's a long-term equipping. And I'm really appreciate the leadership that you're bringing to this. And right now, there's somebody out there listening, or somebody who you know, if you're listening, that can really benefit from this. And so, would you just connect them to this, share this podcast with them, and let the Holy Spirit do His work in their lives, whether they're going to come or not to this one or a future one, because it really will be very important. I really appreciate you being here today and sharing this vision with us, Paolo.
It's my pleasure to be here, Rob. I'm just reminded, those of us that are listening to this, we've inherited this Wesleyan movement.
That's right.
That started in England so long ago, and the uniqueness of this movement is that we would not simply share the gospel, simply get people excited, simply gather people around an idea, but that we would invest in them long term, right? That's the Wesleyan bands and classes and societies. Right. These were long term things, and it was kind of the secret sauce of our movement. And so we want to do the same with young people who are discerning a call to leadership. And I think as a global movement, we owe this to young people, giving them a really great shot at faithfully following Jesus in this day and age for this season in the world.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Paolo, thank you so much. And I want to thank you for listening. Would you take just a minute and rate and subscribe? That really helps us. And with all of the algorithms and all that sort of thing that these different servers do, your rating and subscription and your comments really help us get the word out to others. So we'd be grateful if you would take just a minute to do that. As we mentioned, all of those connections for social media are in our show notes. You can reach out to us for the podcast at worldmethodist.org. We'd love to hear your questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes. We want to be sure to say thank you again to Christ Church Memphis for sponsoring this episode. I'm Rob Haynes, and you've been listening to WME's Real Faith, Real World podcast.